Hello and welcome back, and today we're going to do another NAS comparison. You know what's coming, you saw the thumbnail, but today I want to talk about these two QNAP NASes. I want to talk about the newly released TS-453E, and I want to compare it against the sort of summer but kind of spring 2022, depending where you are in the world, TS-464. And these two 4-bay NAS systems are part of the latest generation of SMB and prosumer desktop solutions in QNAP's portfolio. They both arrive with a tremendous amount of hardware and software inside, and in terms of both of their price points, actually do bring together quite a lot of good value to the end user. Anyone that's been looking at moving away from cloud services, your Google Drives, your OneDrive, your Dropbox, and moving onto your own private server, be it for work and databases and your employees, or surveillance, or Plex Media Server, or just simply as a backup in-house, have almost certainly came across these two NASes on their search. And although they are very similar in their architecture and very similar in what QNAP have produced in their architecture, it has to be said that they have both chosen very specific lanes in the way they've been built, with one key word making a huge amount of distinction between them, and that is future-proofing. One could also say upgradability, because both of these two systems, in terms of what you get on day one for your money and what you can turn it into down the line with a little bit more change and what you want to do down the line, actually does differ depending on the system you go for. But before we go any further, let's talk about what they've got in common. They're both 4-bay NASes with SATA bays inside. They've both got M2 NVMe SSD slots that can be utilised for caching, can be used for Q tier, which creates a single storage pool that's a mixture of hard drives and SSD, with the system moving appropriate data to the right areas of the storage. You can use those NVMEs as raw storage pools if you choose, for the internal systems, for Plex, for VMs, or whatever you want. Talking of Plex and VMs, these two systems arrive with the latest version of QTS 5.1 at the time of recording, which has a whole range of applications and services inside. That includes everything from file management, multimedia management, to surveillance platforms with 8 camera licenses included, virtual machine tools, HDMI parallel output, lots of applications with regards to storage, whether it comes to iSCSI or using third-party cloud storage, either in synchronized form, bolted on form with hybrid mounts, or in doing that in reverse with virtual JBOD there. There's a whole range of applications for SaaS, software as a service platforms, such as Google Workspace and Office 365 using BoxSafe, and there are a myriad of mobile application tools and desktop tools that you can utilize alongside support of AI related services on their surveillance platform, alongside multimedia tools there in Photo Station, QMaggie, Video Station, and Music Station there as well. There's a huge amount of hardware and software potential built into these two devices, and whichever one you go for, you are going to have a great system for file management, for your multimedia, for office applications, and let's not forget backup with Hybrid Backup Sync 3 and virtual machine backup tools all being rolled into this system as well. So again, you've got a great little NAS which one you go for, but now let's talk about what differs. And the first thing that will really surprise you is the pricing structure of these two devices. Now, the 464 has been in the market just a wee bit longer, and at the time of recording, the TS-453E is not actually available in many places, and the price point that's floating around is a great deal closer to that of the RRP. Consequently, now at the time of recording, and again it will be different in the future, I should add, but right now this is more expensive, which as you go through this video will surprise you. At the time of recording, the only website I could find that had some parity data in terms of pricing that was on for both of these devices was box.co.uk, with the TS-453E being listed at £694 and the TS-464 at £607. So again, about, close to 100 nicker difference between them. Once again, this will change as availability of these two lines, becomes, a few months down the line. But right now, this one appears to be the more affordable, which is really odd, given this is higher than this one in their product portfolio. Now, we can talk about price, but price don't mean nout unless you talk about value, arguably what you're getting for that bunce. And these two, the first thing we can look at is their internal architecture, that hardware that you're actually paying for there. Of course, the price you pay includes that software that I rallied through earlier, but in terms of the hardware between the two of them, it has to be said that you are getting a pinch more overall on the TS-464, but crucially, not a world more, just a pinch more there. And given right now that it costs less, that's really odd. Now, the hardware inside the TS-464 is as follows. It has an Intel Celeron-based internal processor there, the N5105. That CPU is a 2.0 GHz processor that can be burst up to 2.9 GHz, and it's a 4-core 4-thread processor there. It also arrives with Intel onboard UHD HD graphics, and the frequency is 450 megahertz up to, when needed, 900 megahertz for that embedded graphics component there. The system, that CPU is rated at 4,116 currently on CPU benchmark at the time of recording. It may have changed by the time this goes live. And the system arrives with 4 gig of DDR4 memory that can be ramped up to 16 gig of memory across 2 slots there. So again, some great architecture there alongside those M2 NVMe slots that are inside. 2 slots inside a PCIe Gen 3x1 architecture there. There's also a PCIe upgrade slot that we'll talk about later on that's PCIe Gen 3x2 that allows you to add 10 GBE cards, 2.5 GBE cards, Wi-Fi 6 and a myriad of other upgrade cards from QNAP and third parties as well. So the TS-453E is designed to be less upgradable, less flexible in its primary architecture. And what you find is that extra money you're paying for is because some elements of its architecture are higher at the beginning than the 464. You are paying a little bit more for a slightly higher level of architecture in some places, which later on you're not going to have the ability to upgrade. Let me explain. So the internal CPU is a J6412, slightly later released Celeron processor there. It has a slightly lower clock speed there at 2.0 GHz that can be burst up to 2.6 when needed, but it is still 4-core, 4-thread in architecture. Now, that CPU also has embedded graphics on board, and that's 350 MHz up to 800 MHz there. So, a slightly lower base frequency for graphics and a slightly lower maximum burst speed as well. Now, that CPU is rated at 3,930 on CPU benchmark, so just a pinch lower there, but it's still overall a better CPU there on the 464. Now, it arrives with 8 gig of DDR4 memory in its base model. Remember, this has 4, this has 8 gig. However, that memory cannot be upgraded, which is a real shame because the CPU inside there can actually support up to 32 gig of memory. But because of the way the architecture and the PCI lanes within that chipset have been utilized, and they've been spread out, something we'll talk about later on, the result is that this system only has 8 gig of memory pre-soldered that can't be upgraded there. So again, less of that longevity upgradability. It has the 2 M2 NVMe slots inside and a higher bandwidth than that of the 464, arriving at PCIe Gen 3x2. So 1000 megs versus 2000 megs for the M2s, but there's no PCIe upgrade slot. You can't add 10G, you can't add Wi-Fi 6, you can't add other network connections and upgrades down the line. They've both got 3 years of manufacturer's warranty, but both of them, you know, in terms of longevity and upgrades, this system supports slightly fewer expansions that I'll talk about later on. It doesn't have the PCIe upgrade, it has the fixed memory, which although good at the beginning, cannot be scaled up later on. And ultimately, in terms of between the two of them, which is better for value, I'm going to say the TS-464, even though This system is part of the Value series and arrives with some parts of its architecture higher at the start than the 464. I think it'd be remiss to ignore the PCIe upgrade slot, the higher frequency CPU, both in traditional throughput and in terms of that graphical frequency, and just generally the upgradability of the 464. But next, let's talk about design. Now, this is an element of complete personal consumer choice. Something I've learned in my reviews. When I think what I think is a better looking NAS, a lot of people will tell me how wrong I am. So for me, looking at these two chassis, I'll tell you right now, I prefer this one. They're both plastic chassis. They're both 4 bays with those 4 SATA drives inside that you can run on just a single drive if you choose. However, I just like this chassis more. The front plastic part, I know not everyone's in love with that. There's no LCD screen there. And also, one might argue in terms of ventilation, that might be problematic. But just in terms of the look and aesthetics, I think this NAS looks slightly better. I like the glossy shine. I like that copper rose gold there. On the sides, we have a little bit of ventilation. We have ventilation on the base. The rear of the device, we'll talk about in just a moment, has that large fan there. Just generally, everything's quite partitioned out nicely. Now, I also have to accept that not everyone feels the way I do, because the 453E has those nice, visible, lockable trays. Yes, you can lock that front panel with a click, but this has key lock trays, and they are removable trays there immediately at the front. There's also a greater degree of ventilation around this chassis, both on the sides and between every single one of those bays, with slightly less ventilation there on the base. This looks a bit more plastic fantastic, although it has the shiny black panel there, and it is slightly more dated looking in its design, but I know a lot of you are going to prefer this chassis overall. They're pretty much exactly the same size, has to be said. And if we look at the rear, we can see that large fan there on the rear, but ultimately when you put them side by side, you can see that that fan is only marginally bigger on the 453E because of the chassis design and the fan panel that it's utilizing. But I would say overall, in terms of cooling and ventilation, the 453E is the better one. But in terms of sheer aesthetic choice, I would pick the 464 there. Now, next up, let's talk about ports and connections, because this is going to be a big deal for a number of us out there. So, in terms of the connectivity between these two devices, there's a slight element of difference between them. So if we look at the TS-464 rear panel there, we of course can see there that PCIe slot that we've already discussed. We've also got a USB 3.2 Gen 2 red port there, so that is a 1000 megabytes per second bandwidth connection, and of course there is another one there on the front for the one-touch copy. Also on the rear, we have 2 USB 2 ports there that are traditionally going to be utilized in a KVM setup along with the HDMI port there. A single 4K 60 frames per second 1080 HDMI 2.0 port there. That USB port there, it should be said, you can utilize those for office hardware there, scanners, printers. You can use them for UPS as well. But also there's lots of third-party peripherals up to and including 2.5G and 5 gigabit Ethernet adapters to add more network ports to this device. And the expansion devices from QNAP as well, arriving in 2, 4, 8 and 12 bay expansion chassis, all connected via USB, some with hardware RAID, some without. Now, if we go down to the bottom, we've got 2 network ports there, with both of these network ports being 2.5 gigabit Ethernet there, so both of them can give you independently around 270 megabytes per second, or you can combine them for close to 600 megabytes per second network connectivity there with a smart switch that supports that protocol. Otherwise, backwards compatible to 1 GBE with ease there. So, how do things compare on the newer, slightly more value series NAS? Well, we have got another USB 3.2 Gen 2 port there. So again, one on the front, one on the rear, but again, both of those ports 1000 meg, supporting exactly the same devices. Also a couple of USB 2 ports, again KVM, office appliances, and 2 HDMI ports there. However, do bear in mind that these HDMI ports are HDMI 1.4B, which means they will only output 4K at 30 frames per second, but 1080p still at 60 frames per second. Also, you can't use them independently. You have to use one as the primary parallel interface there, so it's a completely separate application available for both of these called HD Station. You can output surveillance, multimedia, virtual machines, and a bunch of other third-party apps and homebrew stuff over on QNAP Club. But on top of that, the second one can only be used to either mirror the first port or use an extended screen. So although it seems very similar in terms of connectivity on these devices, we can drill down a little bit more insofar as, firstly, expandability. The 464 has a small amount of increase in its expansion devices. Both of them support 2 and 4 bay expansions, but when it comes to the 8 and 12 bay, the 453E only supports one of those, where the 464 can support 2. Next up, in terms of the device's HDMI output, as mentioned, HDMI on the 464 is of a higher output there overall between the two of them. Now, with the USB ports on both of them, in terms of network bandwidth, they've both got USB 2 and USB 3. So again, localized connected devices are going to be pretty much identical in terms of scope, what you can do on these two devices. But the real kicker is always going to be the fact that you can upgrade the 464 with a PCIe upgrade card. You can add network interfaces, add USB ports, and just add more connectivity on this device. And again, it comes down to that word, future-proofing there, and of course, upgradability overall. Ultimately, between the two of them, I think when we compare these two NASs, it's going to come down to how much you need the NAS to do on day one. Do you need this NAS device to do everything immediately, or are you scheduling how you intend to use this device later down the line in terms of its scalability and abilities? Because if you need everything to work at its highest on day one, you may prefer the 453E. But if you're looking for a system that has the option to upgrade a lot of its components down the line, then the 464 is almost certainly going to be the better choice for you, because both of them are great examples of 4-bay NASs in 2022, and regardless of which one you get, you're going to have a great little RAID-enabled 4-bay moving forward. It's just a question of, do you need it to work to its finest on day one, or you're looking for a system with a little bit more scalability down the line, so you can be a little bit more creative with your budget as time wears on. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this comparison. There should be a link in the description to the written version of this comparison over on NAS Compares below. If you have enjoyed this, chuck me a like. It helps me understand what I'm doing right or wrong. Click subscribe as we compare more NAS, look at data storage in as much detail as possible with a video every day here on the channel. And do take advantage of both the free advice section over on NAS Compares or Ask NAS Compares if you need a question answered by the greater NAS community. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.